Previously on the case of John Benet Ramsey.
It is a form of mental invasion and mental torture of a prisoner, which is forbidden.
The agency couldn't possibly do anything like that. In addition, couldn't conceivably imagine that a thing like that would remain secret forever.
MK Ultra. Let's enter the buzzsaw.
Central Intelligence Agency.
It was described by witnesses as...
Ron Patton's joining us today. He's a conspiracy researcher turned editor-in-chief of Paranoia magazine. He also executive produces Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis, the syndicated radio show. And he's joining us to talk about MK Ultra, Monarch, and other nefarious mind control programs. Ron, great to have you joining us finally.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sean. Glad to be on.
Yeah, we want to start by talking for the novices out there who don't quite know what MK Ultra means. Why don't you introduce us to that concept and what we know about MK Ultra?
Certainly. Well, MK Ultra was a behavior modification program started by both the CIA and Department of Defense, probably around 1947. And basically, we were trying to catch up with the Russians or the Soviets, who were also involved in what was called brainwashing or mind control. And so there were several projects that started out back in the late 40s, and eventually in the early 50s, these projects culminated into a big mind control program called MK Ultra. And essentially what they were trying to do is to create the perfect spy, a spy that wouldn't break under interrogation, that was multifaceted. And it probably went on for about 20, 25 years. However, the reality is, I believe aspects of it still go on today.
So now, where did you intersect with this research into MK Ultra? What brought you into it and incited, let's say, your foray down the rabbit hole?
It came about probably around 1992. I was living in Olympia, Washington at the time, and I went to hear this guy speak at a church. And he talked about being involved in this satanic cult. His family were involved, I guess they were multi-generational Satanists. And he also talked about, as a young child, being tortured, and to the extent where he had multiple personalities. And this basically occurred at a military installation, and he found out that it was at China Lake Naval Weapons Center. And it was like, okay. And, you know, basically my paradigm at the time was that our government wouldn't do these kind of things to children. You know, my dad was in the Navy, and so, you know, I had this persona that, you know, our government was basically good, and we just don't do these kind of things. So I listened to this guy, and he went on to talk about being in this Quonset hut, and within the Quonset hut was a cage, and the cage was divided. So on one part of the cage, you had these children, which he remembers as the expendable ones, and on the side of the cage that he was at, they were the chosen ones. And he was talking about the expendable ones being brutally tortured, raped, electroshocked, and mutilated and murdered. And I just had such a hard time believing that, you know, our government would do that, and I just thought he was crazy. And so after his talk, you know, I went up to him and I said, you know, where's the evidence to substantiate this? I mean, this is pretty horrific stuff. And so he did show me some information from the Freedom of Information Act, but still, it just didn't seem like enough evidence to, you know, really think that this stuff goes on. And, you know, and I told him, I go, if this in fact is true, why isn't it reported in the news? Why don't we see this stuff, you know, all over the place? And he goes, it's the biggest kept secret. This form of mind control is the biggest kept secret because, you know, the public would have such a difficult time believing it. And so that was basically the start.
So you went from there, from hearing this guy with a story that could have been completely created from whole cloth, to actually believing. Now, at what point did you start to realize that these types of mind control, because that's a different level of experimentation we're talking about. I mean, we know from history, we know MK Ultra, as far as documentation goes, there was CIA programs with experimenting with people without their knowledge, being doped, right, drugged, or whatnot. Even some psychological experiments involving electroshock and whatnot at mental hospitals. But
yes,
when it comes to the idea of children, at what point can we say definitively, yes, these programs occurred using children?
Can you describe that to me?
Oh, something.
Yes.
When it comes to the idea of children, at what point can we say definitively, yes, these programs occurred using children?
Well, if I can kind of continue on with that, he introduced me to this guy in Portland like a week later, because he said, "Hey, I'd like to introduce you to my friend Fritz Springmeier, and he has all kinds of information regarding this stuff." And I was extremely curious, and I was also skeptical too. So I went to meet with Fritz, and he was telling me all about this, Project Monarch mind control program, and yeah, I was fascinated, but it was starting to scare me a bit, because I started coming to the realization that this stuff may in fact be true. And so basically for about 3 years I assisted Fritz with research and correspondence. But probably around 1995 I just realized he had a different agenda going on, and he was hanging out with these militia guys, and it was just a little too overwhelming for me. So I parted ways, and then I started doing my own research, and I hooked up with Joan d'Arc and Al Hidell with Paranoia magazine, and I put out an article called Project Monarch Nazi Mind Control in the fall issue of 1996.
And what were the basic conclusions that you had come to at that point?
Well, I realized that this stuff did in fact exist. However, with that said, I also realized that there was a disinformation campaign going on, and that basically out of the 149 sub-projects of MK Ultra, there was no official documentation of a Project Monarch. So again, the premise of Project Monarch had to do with the creation of multiple personality disorder starting as a child. And then what they do is they program each alter personality to do an assigned task or function. So let's say you might have one personality that's programmed to be a drug courier, and you have another personality that's a prostitute, and yet another personality that's a human tape recorder. So basically all these personalities are amnesic from one another, and the way they're accessed is through a trigger or a cue or a password.
Can you describe that to me?
Oh, something.
The way they're accessed is through a trigger or a cue or a password. So that could be audible or visible. The way they're accessed is through a trigger or a cue or a password. So that could be audible or visible.
Something is always happening. But when it happens, people don't always see it, or understand it, or accept it.
The way they're accessed is through a trigger or a cue or a password. So that could be audible or visible. Basically, all these personalities are amnesic from one another, and the way they're accessed is through a trigger or a cue or a password. Yeah, unfortunately, you know, again, we really can't track down exactly a name for this, but I believe there's like 3 or 4 sub-projects. If you put them together, it forms this Monarch stylized form of trauma-based mind control.
Mm-hmm. Now, are we seeing this leaked out into the general public? When we, for example, many people are pointing out music videos where they'll see the butterfly tattoo or the butterfly symbolism, or they'll see the sort of sex kitten symbolism, or various forms of expression of these various different personality types, even to the point of some performers having multiple personalities, or when Beyonce calls herself Sasha Fierce and says, I don't really identify with that person, it's almost as though something else takes over. Are we seeing this as perhaps these artists themselves have been traumatized or have somehow segued with the programs, or is it just sort of, do you think, a leakage of many of the symbols that are meant to disorient us and keep us confused?
I think it's both, actually. Yeah, it's really difficult to say, but I think in part it's just also an aspect of social engineering. So whether it's really triggering people who are programmed, it's hard to say.